Hello and welcome. I'm Kate Cunningham, author of the Flea in History books. This is a series of stories that are highly illustrated with lots of information about particular moments in history. Before writing these stories, I was a primary school teacher for 10 years in inner city schools, and since I've written the books, I've visited hundreds of schools up and down the country, visiting all sorts of different settings. In this video, I'm going to look at some of the hooks in the story, the direct links to artifacts and research, and how it helps us understand this period and the characters that shaped it. And that leads us then to think about how it can stimulate excitement in the topic and develop literacy work. What is exciting about the Mary Rose as a resource is that it's packed full of objects and materials linked to ordinary Tudor sailors. So often we get to see the possessions of wealthy population. These are the things that are preserved and recorded and valued. However, when the Mary Rose sank, it didn't differentiate between the people on board. The seabed of the Solent protected all of the objects, and they give us a unique insight across all social levels of the ship. A story of the length of this one cannot give every answer, but it's perfect for whetting the appetite, triggering ideas and questions that can be used as part of the follow-up work, and ultimately wrapping all this up in a story aims to get the readers excited and curious for more. An important starting point is how this fits into the curriculum. Tudors aren't explicitly included anymore, but they are an essential part of children's understanding of our country. So within the purpose of study, it explicitly states that children must have a chronological understanding of the past in Britain and the wider world. And that includes understanding how England became a maritime power, the building of the Tudor fleet and a navy, the beginnings of the navy, are an important step in England's position and what went on behind that. Henry's reign in particular is key to that, and it's also key to understanding the religious diversity of our country and what happened within relationships across different countries that led to the unification of Britain and Great Britain as we know it now. Henry's relationships, his sisters and their relationships, their marriages and their children, are what ultimately led to England and Wales and Scotland becoming united. The second part of this is historical investigation and becoming a history detective. So history detective's my phraseology for it rather than the curriculum, but the curriculum does explicitly state that children must learn about historical investigation. And there's two ways they can do that. They can learn about artifacts and what they show us and what we surmise from artifacts. And they can learn about sources, about primary and secondary sources, about the people who experienced these events and what records they left. Finally, it's important that children learn about historical interpretation and learn to make decisions, ask questions and make judgments about what they discover. Finding out about objects is all well and good, but that final stage is really important for helping them understand about history and what the implications of the past are for us now.
Hello, I'm Lucy and I work with the learning team at the Mary Rose. We've been really excited to work with Kate and Sam Cunningham on Vlad the Flea and welcoming him and them to the Mary Rose Museum. As Kate will discuss in the rest of this video, the book can really open up the world of Tudor history. And I'm here to talk about how to support the learning in the book. We would recommend a trip to our museum. Seeing the ship herself, seeing the artefacts in person is a really valuable learning experience. All the workshops that we offer at the Mary Rose Museum are built around key disciplinary skills, which we explore in a number of practical ways. In our most popular primary school workshop, Henry's Heroes, the pupils have a chance to handle both real artefacts, which are 500 years old, and replica items, many of which are featured in the book itself, making a really direct link to what you've been reading about in the classroom. We can also study primary sources, written ones and archaeological, and there's even a chance to dress up at the end. The workshop challenges pupils to explore the differences between crew and officers, drawing out ideas about status, social life, wealth, and the diverse range of individuals that make up the Mary Rose crew. We are proud of the fact that we can scientifically prove that we had disabled individuals as crew members, and people from Spain, Italy, all over Northern Europe and North Africa on board. We also run a number of STEM workshops that cover health and diet, the science of the sinking, and even from September 2024, DNA coding. We look forward to introducing you to the world of Vlad and seeing the value of a visit to the Mary Rose. I'll now hand back to Kate to continue to develop the ways in which you can use this amazing resource in the classroom.
So how does this story, Captain Vlad and the Mary Rose, support learning? I like to think of it as having several different layers, and depending on your children and what you want to get from it yourself, they can be accessed at different levels, or all of them. So the first one is fairly straightforward. It's an action-packed adventure story, and it can just be enjoyed in one sitting as a story. Then you can dig a little deeper, look at the pictures and look at the things that are happening in the story and find out the context. Go back and find out about the artifacts and what they were and how we've interpreted them. And the final one is to use the book as a way of inspiring questions and inspiring ideas about the objects, events and people. And I want to look at each of these in a little bit more detail on the following slides. Now, I said simply an adventure story, but obviously there's a whole lot more that you can get from it on that first level. First of all, there is heaps of vocabulary in there. Vocabulary that is specific to ships, but also vocabulary that's enriching for all sorts of other writing, reading and topics. So, for example, a few that I've picked out from the story, a few words that I've chosen are things like mutiny, scurvy, landlubbers, castle deck, obviously specific to a ship. But then the things like rousing, thrashed, churned, and stowed, they're all things that could be used in other stories. And those aren't the only rich pieces of vocabulary in the story, they're just the ones that I pulled out at first sitting. Then there is the idea that this could support comprehension. There are lots of opportunities to ask questions about the story and an opportunity to recreate and sequence the events after having read the story. And finally, there are different directions in which you can make predictions. What's going to happen to the ship? What's going to happen to the rats? The crew sadly go down with the ship, but the rats often escape a sinking ship. And there are ideas about what happened to Henry, what happened to the admirals who weren't on board the ship. There are other directions and other stories that can be told from the starting points within the book. Finally, this story gives an opportunity to create a framework for the children's own writing. It's often really difficult to find the time to do an entirely new story from scratch. What they have here are characters that can be further developed and used within the same framework. They could tell the story from Hatch's perspective, from one of the young crew members' perspective, from the captain's perspective, from the hawk's perspective, there are ample opportunities to take one of the other characters and create the same story, but with a different point of view. And then lastly, within the book, there are so many visual and written pieces of information that link directly back to the history that can be used to pull out factual information for factual writing. So I'm going to look at the next slide where we think about the actual links between the artifacts and the illustrations. The next layer, beyond it being a straight story, is looking a little bit more deeply and finding the links between specific material in the Mary Rose Museum and material in the book, where Sam, as the illustrator, has imagined and visualized how those objects were when they were in the hands, on the feet, being used by the sailors who actually were living amongst them. And on these next two slides, I've got some specific examples. Again, they are not the only examples. There are lots scattered on every page throughout the book. But rather than spend the next half hour talking about specific images, I'm going to pick out a few key ones. And there is a teacher's guide that goes page by page, going through every single one of them in much more detail. But for example, on this page, we have the brick oven, which was one of two brick ovens which was in the hold right at the bottom of the ship. Now this one kind of blew my mind when I found out about it. The idea that the Tudors were cooking their food at the very bottom of a ship, in the dark, in a brick oven, two brick ovens, was really kind of mind-blowing, and I think it's a starting point of lots of interesting discussion about what it must have been like trying to cook on those. The second picture in this shows shoes and the handle of a dagger and a knit comb, which I will come to again in a moment. And again, Sam has visualised a character who is wearing those shoes and got a knife tucked into his belt. It's not a big, this is a small clipping of that picture, but the picture itself is much bigger, but it shows you how much detail is in every character. Again, we've got three pictures that dig down into the detail. So in the Mary Rose Museum, there is a skeleton of a dog named Hatch, named by the museum, and he makes an appearance and is very important to the story. He is visualised into the story. He is a terrier that would have been there specifically to keep the rat population at bay, which is integral to the story, because obviously the story is being narrated by Vlad and his trusty crew of rats are under threat from a terrier on board. The next picture below that, below Hatch, is of musical instruments. And one of the things that children find particularly difficult to understand is life before electricity. They often understand it and can say that there was no electricity, but then digging down and trying to really understand how they entertained themselves and what they did when there was no music, no radios, no computers, all of those things is way more tricky. So this shows how sailors would have entertained themselves, each other, and again it shows it in context. Once more, this is a very small piece of a large detailed illustration, but in one corner of the ship there's a group of sailors entertaining themselves. And finally, I couldn't leave without doing a little deeper look at one of the many, many combs that was found amongst all of the objects on the Mary Rose. And fleas would have been a real problem for sailors living up close, living with animals. There would have been the dog, but also there might have been other livestock on long journeys. And in this picture, one of the archers is is grooming himself and hopefully getting rid of some of his problematic fleas. So the final layer is how to take this beyond the book, beyond the images in the book and the story and the vocabulary there. And that is about asking questions and really digging down into these characters. So it might be thinking about the people in the book and what they're feeling and eating, things that we can't see specifically in the book but could be researched. Hot seating with children in the position of the dog, the rats, or some of the young sailors. What was it like living below deck? What did it smell like? How did they fill their days? What was it like having to make cannonballs to the right size? Did they get to eat potatoes and pasta? The answer to which is no, they didn't, because those weren't available to them. With older children, it might be interesting for them to find out about people like the admirals of the Mary Rose. The admirals were incredibly important and wealthy men who had a lot of influence. They were related to several of Henry VIII's wives, and their final admiral, when the Mary Rose went down, he survived. He wasn't aboard the Mary Rose, he was on board another ship, but he became influential in looking after Henry VIII's young son when he came to the throne as a child. Finally, there are really big questions that can be asked. There are things about how having all these ships impacted trade and the future of getting things like potatoes, about how it impacted exploration, colonization, people going out into the world, finding out more, but also forming relationships with other people around the world, whether those are relationships that are good or bad. How inventions and developments on ships were carried out, what they found out about the way ships floated and sank and the way that they sailed and how they improved on ships, and discussions about how Britain became a superpower in terms of its position in the world because of its dominance at sea. So I've talked a lot about the history and about how the historical artefacts give us historical information and can be used to question further. But one of the things I feel quite passionately about is that all the books are helpful in literacy work. So there are so many ways that you could pick and choose literacy work that was inspired and helped by this book. There are some fairly straightforward things, such as creating letters from the captain. What might the captain be writing home to his wife and family at home, or any of the other characters for that matter? So I'm choosing the captain because he's most likely to be literate. There can be, as we've mentioned before, there can be stories created about some of the other characters, either that reflect the story in this book or that move beyond this, what happened beyond this book or to other people not on this particular ship. It would be ideal for creating non-chronological reports, taking particular illustrations, labelling them, giving a bit more detail about what these objects were, what they were used for, and what they're made of, and all those kind of things that are useful for putting into non-fiction material. And then it could be used to make a news report, to either tell information about this story or to explore further about the sinking or about the raising of the wreck many years later. Some of the illustrations I think are really evocative. So, for example, the illustration of the storm would just be so exciting and interesting in terms of creating poetry, thinking about the waves and the way that the waves make the ship move. I think there's a great potential for using that for poetry inspiration. And then finally, there's instructions. You could think about how these rats are playing this game. What game are they playing? What are the instructions for playing it? Or how you would make ship's biscuit. So thinking about some of the food and recipes. And ship's biscuit is a really interesting one. It doesn't require a great many ingredients. It's basically water and flour, and you bake it. So it's fairly straightforward. But at the same time, it was also really important for thinking about how you could get flour and potentially cooking ingredients for bread onto a ship that wouldn't be able to get fresh ingredients for quite a long time. Then there's the rest of the curriculum. You have lots of opportunity to be thinking about ship design, creating model ships. I am planning to do some work myself to work out how to make a junk model ship using just cardboard and glue guns. You've got things like the waves. There's lots of other artists that have illustrated waves, and I think doing things like print artwork with waves could be quite exciting, looking at Hokusai, other cultures' representation of waves. And as I mentioned in the last slide, you've got cookery, making ship's biscuit, though with the understanding you're not going to end up with anything particularly interesting to eat at the end of it. But in itself, that's a very good talking point about what it must have been like being stuck eating quite a potentially bland diet and repetitive diet over a long period of time aboard a ship. There are some great opportunities for linking to science topics. You have the whole discussion around forces, about buoyancy and floating, and what materials you would make a ship from if you had absolute choice, and the importance of ballast. So in one of the pictures at the bottom in the hold, there are lots of stones which were used to stabilize the ship and make sure it moved more smoothly through the water. And finally, forces such as wind power. You see discussions of people talking about how we can use this new power of wind power, and it's very easy to forget, but it's actually been one of the things that we have been trying to harness for centuries in different ways with windmills and sailing ships. So there's potential to look at the whole history of wind power and where we've used it in the past and where we're taking it into the future. So in summary, when you use Captain Vlad and the Mary Rose, you have a story, you have lots of exciting prompts that give you some direct information about what it was like to be a Tudor, and specifically a Tudor sailor. It gives you lots of contextualization, lots of looking at those objects and putting them into actual scenarios, which for some children is incredibly, and adults, is incredibly difficult, really, really hard to look at a physical object and imagine for yourself what it would be like if it was being used in the hands of somebody in the past. And then you're making links between life in general, links between what was happening in the wider world, why the English are fighting the French, what the relationship is between England and the rest of Europe, or between England and Scotland, and what the future of those relationships is, and thinking about how that goes forward in terms of relationships between England and other countries, and using that sailing capacity to be able to go forward in other parts of the history. And I think as well, hopefully I've shown that it doesn't just help with the history, it gives so many creative and interesting ways of spreading out into other areas of the curriculum, particularly into literacy, where it's a really exciting resource to be able to take some of those images and ideas and hook those into the children's own writing. I hope you found all of the ideas in this helpful. There are lots of amazing resources available out there, and there are free resources on the Reading Riddle website, which is www.readingriddle.co.uk, and there is a teacher's guide that gives a much more detailed breakdown. On the Mary Rose Museum, there is lots of context, lots of ideas, and you can find out more about seeing and looking at those objects up close in detail and finding out what they really looked like.